I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. It's Mike Boyle getting back on the Tipping Point bicycle, taking you through another trip where we look at this concept of community. And the subject today will be mutual aid. And I will continue with some of the thoughts that I started with last week tied to martial guns. First off, I'd like to start with the idea, why do we organize? And there were some thoughts that I collected this week that I'd like to go ahead and share with you. It was tied to this idea of obviously empowerment, one that I talk about quite often. In fact, I think with every show I talk about empowerment in some fashion. And I stumbled across a publication coming from John McKnight, and he alludes to this issue in a publication he put out titled "Services Are Bad for People." And what he stated was somewhat revolutionary, especially if we think about a city like Vienna, where the whole system is based upon these components. So he states, services are for people. You are either a citizen or a client. And what he was alluding to is that if you're a consumer, which is basically tied to services, then nothing's expected from you. You automatically develop some sort of detachment. And we shouldn't be surprised if we as a populace, the nation of consumers, continue to feel disillusioned with the situation. We are not happy with the performance of our service providers, and I'm thinking specifically tied to the government. And this is a continuous cycle. Then I came to the conclusion, what do social services and waste management have in common? They are both interested in maintaining key components of those things that they're managing, and they are the things that we're trying to get rid of. So obviously with waste management, they would have no business if we were not to produce waste anymore. So what does it look like from the social services perspective? If we no longer have impoverished, if we no longer have the non-empowered, meaning that everybody feels empowered, then the reason to be gets lost. Actually, it disappears, if you ask me. And so this is a real issue for some of these institutions that we've put together. And I know I don't make friends with such comments. But I raise these points with the clear intention of getting some of you to look at things from a different perspective. It was very interesting. Again, I talk about these subjects not just here on the program, but rather I am eating, breathing, sleeping these components, especially now. And I had a conversation with somebody yesterday who is responsible for an NGO. And it's very often the case I'll come up with some provocative statements that are not necessarily directed towards the individual per se, but rather comments that are intended to get people to think. And so the natural reaction of this person was to defend the status quo, although in reality, this person realized that the status quo very often is the root of these problems, looking at it from a structural perspective. And so this conversation continued, and by the end of the conversation, she said, well, actually, you're right. Which I thought was a very interesting way of conducting a dialogue. In other words, that we automatically go to the barricades and try to defend something, although we are not responsible for this. There is really no skin in the game, or maybe that is the issue, that everybody does have skin in the game in this current situation, these current structures, and indeed that is what we need to look to change. Who are my people? 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 Choice points. Choice points are these moments of truth that we have when we faced some sort of challenge or have made a choice in some fashion, experienced an outcome, or perhaps have learned a lesson. And last week I talked about 3 components to be found within the structures from Marshall Gans: the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And within that concept of the story of us, that being you and me and everybody else that we consider to be part of our tribe, we focus on these choice points. But instead of the individual being the focal point, we look at the community, the entire community as being the focal point, and those things that motivate us to act. And of course, this is very much tied to various facets of leadership. There's one that I'd like to go ahead and share with you. A leader is best when people barely know she exists. When her work is done, her aim fulfilled, they will say, "We did it ourselves." Which for me is the basis of what is called servant leadership. Now, servant leadership is a concept that we've known for a very, very long time. Servant leadership goes back at least 2,000 years, if we're looking at it from Judeo-Christianity perspective. But we noticed that due to the conflicts that were taking place in the 1960s, and I hope to be able to get to some of these points later on in this program, the focus went from obeying orders or a patriarch-based society to something that was much more loosely formed. And in fact, the idea was to move 180 degrees to that of what we had before, and that would be tied to structures. And so we thought, well, everybody should be able to do what they want. And the only way that we can truly create that atmosphere is through eliminating all types of structures. Because structures by nature, people thought were an inhibitor. There was a gentleman by the name of Robert Greenleaf who was very concerned about the trend that was taking place coming out of those years, late 60s, where most of these thoughts were being professed. And so Greenleaf started to put his thoughts together and to describe them in the form of a concept that he called the servant leader. And the servant leader is someone who is there to serve others. And by serving others, we as a group are able to truly flourish. There is a lot to be said about this concept. And as you might have picked up in the citation that I just passed on, tied to leadership coming from Lao Tzu, that this concept really isn't anything new. Considering that we're talking about concepts that weren't invented today, they've been around for a while, I thought it would be good to start this journey in looking at the concept of community and what it was before and what's developed out of it, and to what degree and which predicament do we find ourselves in today. First off, we have to realize that this concept of the nation state is not something that we've had for a long time. Just going back 250 years, perhaps, maybe not even that long, we only had two nation states, and one was relatively new, that being France. If we looked at all of Europe, either based on the monarchy, which we know here quite well, or a collection of fiefdoms going back to the remnants of the 30 Years' War. But our town was the community. And of course, we have plenty of these communities here today if we spend some time in the countryside. Smaller towns where everyone knows everybody, then by nature you have to at least be aware of those individuals who are perhaps not doing as well as you are. Whether you have sympathy or not might be another question completely. But one thing's for sure, within those smaller communities, you had to make do with what you have or what you had. And of course, we had professions or trades, but many of the tasks that were being completed in those communities fell outside of that realm. So if you needed to have something done, very often either you would do it yourself or you would know somebody within the community who could do it. They might not necessarily have a title. They might not have some certification, but they were capable, and you were able to go ahead and move forward. Obviously, there are a lot of tasks that we need to complete that we just can't do on our own from a physical perspective, and so it's important to be able to mobilize individuals to help you along the way. And as we moved forward in our progress train, we had, of course, the expansion of cities, which meant that some of these communities that were very autonomous were more or less compelled to become part of something much bigger. We know that from looking at the history of the city of Vienna over the last 120 years. And there are numerous other examples to be found where that consolidation was taking place. In fact, I come from a city that went through such a metamorphosis as well, the city of Los Angeles. And of course, tied to this concept of the pace of progress has had a very strong effect in the way that we actually look at the community, quote unquote, and how we look at ourselves. And I think it's very much tied to this concept, as I mentioned, coming out of the 60s, where by the time we ended up with the 70s, we ended up being a collection of individuals because we felt that the only way for us to flourish is to continuously profess who we are as individuals. But of course, by putting the emphasis there, we have lost something along the ways. And certainly with the invention of the internet, that tendency has become even larger. Now, today we have virtual communities, and of course, there's a good chance that you might be listening to this or watching, and I will never get a chance to meet you. So the community has kind of become this demographic indicator and not an entity itself, something that we as a collective believe in, and certainly not something where we find common identity. And so tied to this milieu where we find ourselves in being a collective of millions of people that are like mini islands and have scant contact to each other, and through creating a structure where a number of people fall through the cracks. The idea of mutual aid looks very, very enticing. And of course, the idea of mutual aid has been around for a long time. If we look at the situation within these communities, the ones I was referring to, very often the whole structure was based upon this concept of mutual aid. And it's quite clear, due to the turbulence that was caused by the pandemic, that we realized the importance of mutual aid more than perhaps we ever did. So, what is this concept of mutual aid? Mutual aid is a form of solidarity-based support in which communities unite against some sort of common struggle, instead of actually letting people fend for themselves. And we have a number of examples of mutual aid throughout history. Going back thousands of years, if we look at the diaspora of the Jewish people, and we see how, interestingly enough, a tendency or a trend that we have in this concept of community building, due to the affinity, due to the identity, if one specific sector, professional sector, becomes quite established within a certain ethnicity, that this automatically becomes a magnet. And we have a number of examples of where that's taken place. Within the history of the United States, we can go back and find numerous examples of where African Americans have been compelled to provide mutual support, because without that, the situation would have been infinitely worse. And one example that I particularly like is that coming from the Black Panther Party, who established a free breakfast program in the city of Oakland, understanding all too well that within this concept of mutual help, you give without expecting something in return. And through those actions, the concept of community becomes much more strengthened. I think it's safe to say that if we look at the concept of the labor movement or fraternal societies, where they would actually go ahead and provide food and healthcare and housing for those individuals, specifically those that were on strike, that indeed that was the only way for those groups to get through the struggle, because obviously they were battling certain elements of society that under other circumstances they were bound to lose. And through this bonding that we have in concepts like mutual aid, we're constantly building intentional relationships. So what is this idea of an intentional relationship? We go out of our way to set up bonds, knowing full well that through these bonds, these are the basis of the community, the ones that we want to be part of, the ones that we want to drive, the ones that give us purpose. And within this concept of intentional relationships, there are certain elements that stand out quite pronouncedly. One of them being shared values. Now, shared values can either be a natural attraction. In other words, we notice by having a discussion that those values that we have are the same. And so that of what puts us together or bonds us together are those shared values. And of course, perhaps in comparison to the current trend where relationships, quote unquote, are very fleeting, when we talk about intentional relationships, we're talking about something that should actually be long-term, based on something that we're striving for. We know that it will take a while, and we know we need each other to actually go ahead and get to those goals. If indeed our goal is to develop what I call a regenerative community, where we set up structures where the resources in our community, and the resources, of course, are the citizens of the community, all of nature to be found in the community, the various activities taking place within our community, that through these actions, through our efforts, we allow for the community to flourish, and we can see a direct relationship between those things that we do, we as a collective, we as an individual, and we can see how our community actually flourishes by performing these actions. An intentional relationship needs to be created by mutual commitment and mutual consent. This is not something that is imposed on us. This is something that we choose freely. And we know through our choice, through our commitment, that the actual strength of the community is to be found within these components. And, of course, these types of relationships, like all relationships, are not something that's put together and you're done. They are moving parts that we need to focus on constantly. We need to make sure that what we expected is still there. We need to understand the difference between our responsibility and the individual expectations we might have. And I think this is a very key point. If we were to look at these elements, an obligation, responsibility, and expectations in the form of a triangle. Unfortunately, the one that we put the most focus on are obligations, because we've created structures where everything's based upon an obligation. We feel that we don't have any choice. With that, we lose our empowerment. Looking this from the flip side, if we have a free choice for that of what we actually go ahead and complete, and we know for a fact that by professing that choice, that we take on the responsibility of the actions that we've taken on, and we are indeed accountable for the results coming out of those actions. But of course, there's always some sort of misalignment when we look at such components. So from an individual perspective, you've made a commitment, you are willing to take the responsibility, and you see yourself as being accountable. Now, there might be somebody else within that community who feels that what you've committed yourself to and what you're actually delivering are not in alignment. Furthermore, there's one component that we should never forget from this equation, that we are talking about human beings and none of us are infallible. Or conversely, we are all fallible. And so within this construct, how do we go ahead and build in some sort of check to make sure that our viewpoint towards the others is not based upon some sort of preconceived expectations? And in fact, in that ideal world, we forgo the necessity for us as individuals to expect something from each other, because in essence, the concept should be based upon free will. And so you can see a correlation, or a connection better said, between these three components, that being the concept of obligation, the sense of responsibility and accountability, and the expectations of others, because it's very easy for those decisions we make through free will to be interpreted differently by somebody else. And in fact, the whole thing ends up becoming an obligation. And this is one of the dangers that we have, regardless of whether we're trying to come up with a system based upon mutual aid, inevitably trying to take a community to a level of where we do feel empowered. We do not need other entities, be it a government or whatever it may be, to manage our affairs, because we know that we can manage it better because it's in our interest and we are the ones that make the choice. As mentioned, we've noticed a very interesting phenomena tied to the idea of mutual aid, and we found specifically in the United States and our technology is proving to be ever the interesting part that makes things every day an adventure. In any case, we've noticed that the concept of mutual aid has taken on a special importance through the necessity created through the pandemic. And there was one particular initiative that I'd like to go ahead and share with you today, and this is coming primarily from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a congressperson coming from the city of New York in the United States. And she created with others, I'm going to call it a handbook called Mutual Aid 101, and the hashtag is We Got Our Block. And the intention of this mutual aid network that she was in the process of establishing, obviously not just a one-off. We know that a movement is only a movement if we're able to come up with a collective, we're able to go ahead and scale that of what we're trying to do. But the key idea of Ocasio-Cortez and the others who participated in this effort was for individuals, or groups, better said, to create their own mutual aid network. And there's a basic tenet that you find going back to the beginning of this program, where I talk about waste management and social services, that in essence they are compelled to ensure that the affliction stays with us, because otherwise they lose their reason to be. And so the focus is on solidarity and not charity. And there are a number of ways of actually looking at this statement. The first one being that the welfare of all is tied to the individual. And this truly is a key component. In other words, if the individual is suffering, then within a healthy community structure, then that should have an effect on the entire community. Here, I think that we can clearly learn from nature, just using the example of ants and how they work together and how they are able to go ahead and carry elements that are much heavier than them, but they're able to do it. And one of the reasons why, well, certainly they have a certain dexterity that we as human beings, well, certainly yours truly doesn't have it. Maybe some of you might, but I don't. But the key for the ants, in my opinion, is that they're able to work as a group. If you watch them, you see how each ant has a specific role. And within this construct, if indeed there's a failure through one or more of the ants, that leads to the overall detriment of the entire colony. And this is clearly a point, something that we have lost through time, through this sense of progress, quote unquote, where we feel that we alone is good enough. And don't get me wrong, being someone who believes very much in my own freedom and my own ability, and that's something that cannot be discarded. The point being that we don't make a selection. We're not making a choice. In fact, I would claim that sense of self that Marshall Gans talks about is imperative for us to actually go ahead and better understand the story of us. And Gans argues that without having a proper story of self, we're not able to establish this story of us. Here we've gone full circle back to the point of the mutual aid 101 coming from Ocasio-Cortez, where they make the claim that it's solidarity and not charity. And there are some other elements that are critical for this concept. One being the idea of cooperation instead of competition. That only by working on things together are we able to come up with solutions to those things that we seem to look at from an individual perspective as being insurmountable. And of course, two other major components that should be part of any initiative, those being the sense of empowerment, of course, and a close corollary, that being a sense of dignity. But of course, if we look at all these points, the ones that I just finished listing here, you will notice that these are like building blocks that are essential for the foundation of us actually going ahead and creating those communities that we need for us to make progress. I'd like to share with you another story. This is coming also from around that time. The actual date was 1970. And there's somebody else that I've mentioned in these programs, Elinor Ostrom, who was a professor at the Indiana University and was the first female Nobel Prize winner back in 2009 for economics, And for me, my introduction to Elinor Ostrom was tied to this concept of the commons, or the common good, or those things that belong to all of us. And of course, how can we manage them better? I think it was very interesting that in comparison to that viewpoint that we had in the beginning of the 70s, end of 60s, beginning of 70s, that structures were inhibiting, Ostrom felt much different about this subject, that we do need clear structures for these components to work properly. And so one of the studies that Ostrom put through when she started her journey in academia was tied to a common concept we also have here in Austria today. And the idea is that the more centralized the police force and the more money that they get, there's a clear correlation between crime, the number of police, the money that you pump into law enforcement, and the crime that's actually taking place. And so Ostrom wanted to go ahead and test this theory because, of course, this is often the case. We believe in things, or we believe that these assumptions are true, and we never really test them. Well, Ostrom wanted to go ahead and test this. So she went and put together an experiment coming up with the hypothesis and the a-hypothesis. Her hypothesis was that actually these figures are inversed, that the less you do along these lines, in other words, the smaller the police force, and the less you actually go ahead and invest in such activities, the safer your community becomes. And so she performed this experiment, was able to go ahead and confirm the hypothesis, and the findings were very, very interesting. And this all ties into this concept of mutual aid, and certainly the concept of the community. And it all goes back to the idea of whether we are consumers, taking in services and expecting somebody else to go ahead and manage it, or are we citizens, are we active citizens and take individual and collective responsibility for that of what takes place in our neighborhoods. And so through this comparison that Ostrom put together, she was able to realize that if the police force was not pronounced, then each individual in society, that meaning every citizen, felt more of a sense of responsibility for that of what's taking place within the community. So perhaps some of those tasks that would have been handed over to the police otherwise were inadvertently being taken on by the citizenry. And so Ostrom was able to go ahead and show, due to this concept of solidarity, due to this concept of active participation in our community, that by throwing more money within security, that actually it has a counterintuitive effect, i.e., it actually makes the situation worse. Then, of course, Ostrom, wanting to make sure that this was not a one-off. Interestingly enough, she had individuals from the Afro-American community who were helping with regards to research on this particular concept she was working on. And they more or less said, why don't you come down to our neighborhood and try it out, and let's see if this one works. And so their point was, it's great that you keep studying these white neighborhoods, but the issue of policing in the neighborhoods of these Afro-Americans was even more critical. And of course, as we know, going back to the George Floyd only being the tipping point of something that's been going on for a very, very long time, that being the relationship. Let's start with the expectations that we have of the police, the job that they are to fulfill, for whom they are actually going ahead and completing these activities. Those individuals who are getting the brunt of those decisions, the brunt of those objectives, the brunt of our affliction, the affliction of our community. So she took them up on their offer and decided to go ahead and recreate the exercise within various Afro-American communities, and came to the same conclusion. And so the question that I raised to you, within this forum that we should be striving for within this community, where we are no longer consumers of services, we are active participants within our community. We do not look at ourselves as being consumers, but producers, producing responsibility, taking on accountability, and especially taking on a certain responsibility for those others that perhaps have not been as fortunate as we have within our society. And I think there's another very key component to be taken into consideration when we're talking about this concept of mutual aid. And that is we are not talking about a transactional relationship. In other words, just because I've done something for you doesn't necessarily mean that it's conditional. In other words, I expect something from you. Because within this construct of mutual aid, within this construct of a regenerative community, within this ideal of a community that thrives, it's based on structures knowing full well that you do things because you want to. Free choice, not obligation. You know why you're doing it, and the reasons could be manifold, actually. It could be going back to the idea of feeling good because you've done something. And the idea, of course, here is the person who's giving is actually the benefactor. And of course, the concept of reciprocity. Reciprocity meaning that because I did this, I expect something in return. Because within such structures of a thriving community where mutual aid is a key component, number one, it would be the last thing that you would think of is that you would immediately get something in return. But it's kind of like, in case of emergency break glass, you know, if indeed you need help, that you can go back to the community and you have a number of individuals who look at things from the exact same perspective, the same one that you do. And you know somebody out there will be able to help you. Now, if we take this construct and we look at it from an efficiency perspective, of course, this has to be much more efficient, because when you need help, how do you know that the individual that you provided help to, that they can actually help you? But if we take this concept of loose ties that Mark Granovetter talks about, he wrote a paper comparing strong ties and weak ties. Weak ties is the phrase he used. That it's having those loose networks that you can go ahead and call out to that will be the ones that will be able to help everybody in the community because of the lack of obligation, the propensity of free will, the belief in the strength of the community, which is really the key component. You have to have faith within that type of situation that when that day comes where you need help, that there will be somebody out there who could actually go ahead and perform that for you. So these are the prerequisites for a system, as Ocasio-Cortez is promoting, looking at Mutual Aid 101. Because without these ideas, without these beliefs, the rest of it's not going to work. No, it won't. And looking at the structures that we need to create something much bigger than the community, much bigger than us, of course, but much bigger than the community. That means that we need to go ahead and allow for these ideals to be understood, that these ideals can be implemented by everyone within the community. And of course, that these methods can be easily copied. And if we look at our communities, and we take a city like Vienna, which of course to take on such an endeavor in a city of 2 million people, or close to 2 million people, is clearly no easy endeavor. So we have to start at a much smaller nucleus. In those areas where we feel collectively we have an overview of what's taking place, we have the sense of command that we understand the area that we're trying to cover, and we can make a difference. And they would have to be the main prerequisites, the main elements that need to be in place for us to move forward. But let's assume we do reach success. And I have to make that assumption. That shouldn't surprise you. Then the question is, what do we do for an encore? We're talking about transformation, meaning that area that we're referring to here will look different once we're finished. And Marshall Gans talks about a lot of these elements, especially if we look at it using another theory that perhaps you might have heard of. It's called the Tuckman ladder. This comes from Mark Tuckman, and this was developed back in 1965. Anyone who studied organizations or going on for an MBA, I'm sure this was covered. It's the idea of the group being formed, or the forming part, and then you move on to the turbulence, which is called storming. And then you finally get it together, you're in the flow as a team, and that's the phase that we call norming. And once the team is properly organized and things just work naturally, you're performing. And then through Tuckman's model, he mentions that because these things eventually do come to an end, he was looking at more from a project perspective, then we come to the adjourning or the closing phase. Well, for Gans, he looks at these things much different. So what I'd like to do is kind of compare the way that Marshall Gans looks at it and perform a face-to-face comparison to the Tuckman ladder. So for Gans, the first step is understanding the potential. Who are the potential stars that you have within the community? Because again, for Gans, it's all about scalability and not just staying with that one unit, but how can you quickly move forward to build something much bigger? And then you go on to the team formation, which is the forming and storming part under Tuckman. Then the actual creation of the team, which is the norming part, and then the developed team, which is the performing. And then there's another element that Gans talks about is team transformation, which is what you really need to make sure that all of this scales. So as always, I look at the clock and I see that we are reaching the end of this program. So I thank you, as always, for allowing me to share some of my thoughts.